Hello, scholars of American government. Welcome to part 1 of 3 lessons about the Electoral College. Before you get started watching this, I think you should take out a piece of paper, and at the top, you should write how it works and why it exists. And as you go through this video of me going through this presentation, you should write down what speaks to you as the most important things to understand about what the Electoral College is and how it works. You're gonna be glad you wrote this stuff down when it comes to other parts in the project. So take a breath, get a piece of paper, and let's start talking about the Electoral College. We've gone over this a little bit on Election Fridays, but just to recap, the Electoral College is not a place. You cannot get a degree from the Electoral College. It is just a procedure that is developed by the framers of the Constitution and edited in a couple amendments for electing the president and, by nature, vice president of the United States. So it's just a procedure, it's a process, it's a set of steps to elect the president. Why it's here, what the framers thought. There was a lot of debate. You might remember from Unit 3 when we talked about the Constitutional Convention, those 55 delegates who gathered to kind of revise the Articles of Confederation. We talked about the 3/5 Compromise, we talked about the Great Compromise, the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, all that great stuff. Another debate at the Constitutional Convention was, how do we elect the president? How do we get a president? How do we fill the executive branch? Some delegates at the convention wanted Congress to decide who the president would be. Others wanted the people alone to vote for the president. So that would be the popular vote. So the compromise, yet again, another compromise, was this process of the Electoral College, which attempts to bridge both of those ideas. There's some like governmental selection of the president, and there's some people voting for the president. So we'll talk in the following slides a little bit more about how that works. So here was the vision, right? Each state would be given a specific number of electoral votes, and that number of electoral votes is that state's number of senators, which is 2. Every state has 2. That was that New Jersey Plan compromise. So electoral votes for each state equals number of senators plus number of representatives. The representatives number changes depending on the state's population. So number of representatives plus number of senators equals the number of Electoral College votes that each state gets. Because of that second part, that it's added the House of Representatives, that means that the more people who live in a state, the more Electoral College votes that state's going to get. And then the electors would decide who the next president is. When the framers came up with this idea, they envisioned electors as free agents, meaning they didn't think electors would have to vote the way their state did. That has changed, but at the original kind of vision was that these electors wouldn't have to vote the way their state did. So just to recap for you real quick about this slide, each state has a certain number of Electoral College votes. That number of votes is determined by how many senators that state has and how many representatives that state has. Add those numbers together, and that's the number of Electoral College votes that state gets. This process effectively means that the people who vote, voters, don't determine the president. Electors do. And this is something that both Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed on. They didn't trust you and me to be able to select a leader who was qualified. And so they created this process in an effort to kind of curb who the people might want as a president. The Electoral College would also give, this means that all states, both big ones and small ones, have a role to play in who becomes the president. And this was kind of the bargaining chip to states, because at this debate, states were like, whoa, wait a minute. What role do we play in, like, we should have a say in who the president is. And so this Electoral College process kind of gave that power to states in a way. So at this juncture, it's interesting to think about, do you think this is a good process so far? If you were a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, would you have voted for this? So the way it works today, there are 538 total electoral votes. That means that a candidate needs 270 of that 538 in order to be elected president. So that is kind of the fast and dirty version of why it exists. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how it works. Each state can decide how they want to disperse their electoral votes. Almost every state, except for 2, are a winner-take-all kind of process. So what that means is that if a candidate wins the popular vote, it doesn't matter how close the race was, but if a candidate wins, that winning candidate gets all of the electoral votes from that state. So most states are a winner-take-all. There are 2 exceptions. They are Maine and Nebraska. So here's what makes Maine and Nebraska different. They split their electoral college votes. So candidates receive an electoral vote for winning each of the congressional districts, and 2 electoral votes for getting the most votes statewide. So you get votes based on the districts you win, which is kind of works like the way the House of Representatives does. And then you get an additional 2 if you won the most votes in the state. But again, most states, all these orange states, are a winner-take-all. Only Nebraska and Maine choose to split these up differently. Let's bring it a little closer to home and talk about Missouri in the Electoral College and the election of the president and vice president. Missouri has 10 electoral votes. So 2 of those votes come because we are a state and we have 2 senators. And then 8 of those votes come because, according to our population, we have 8 representatives, 8 members of the House. So we're going to talk about a fictional example using Missouri. So let's say that John Adams is running against Thomas Jefferson. And the popular vote in Missouri works out like this. Adams wins by a super narrow margin. Adams gets 50.1% of the votes, which means that Jefferson got 49.9% of the votes. This was a very close race. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how does that work for the Electoral College votes? It was a really close popular vote. How will the electoral votes be dispersed? You'll remember that, like almost every other state, Missouri is a winner-take-all. So even though Adams only won by a very thin margin, he gets all 10 of the Electoral College votes. So this is the small example of one of the ways that our electoral college works in a winner-take-all state, which most states are. Okay, we're going to take this example a little bit further. Now let's assume that every state vote for Adams versus Jefferson works out the same way that it did in Missouri. That means that in every other state, Adams gets 50.1% of the votes and Jefferson gets 49.9%. It would be a very close popular vote, but the Electoral College vote would work out like this. If every state voted the same way that Missouri did, even though we had almost half of people wanting Jefferson, he would get exactly 0 Electoral College votes because of the way that electoral votes are dispersed. Okay, now that you have thought about one example of how a presidential race could work, I'm curious to know if you think that the winner-take-all method by Missouri is the way you prefer, or if you think the different method used by Nebraska and Maine is better. So as you go through this Pear Deck presentation on Classroom, there's going to be a space for you to write what you think. Do that. Tell me which method, Missouri or Nebraska, you prefer, and then tell me why. That's the important part, the why. One of the questions that gets raised a lot when we're talking about the Electoral College is how a president, or a candidate rather, can win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College, or win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. And that's happened 4 times since we've been electing presidents, most recently in 2016. So we're going to talk about how that happens. How exactly is it that a president who is elected by the Electoral College can lose the popular vote, or can win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College? So we're going to work in Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois to talk through this example. Okay, in Missouri, we have 2.5 million eligible voters. So we have 10 Electoral College votes. Iowa has 1.5 million eligible voters. Because of their population, they get 6 Electoral College votes. Now, Illinois has 5 million eligible voters, and they get 20 Electoral College votes. So that kind of gives you an indication of how these 3 states work, and we're going to work through how it is that the candidate could win this majority but lose this one. Win, yeah, okay. So let's say Adams wins the popular vote in 2 of the 3. If he wins 2 of these 3, doesn't matter what 2, any 2, does that mean he'll win the most electoral votes? Let's take a look at the math. Let's do this. If he wins Iowa and Illinois, will he get the most Electoral College votes? But what if he wins Missouri and Iowa? Will Adams get the most Electoral College votes? So if you look at the different numbers, you can start to see how different states can affect the Electoral College vote differently. Let's keep talking about it. So the popular vote kind of works like this. Let's say in Missouri, 2 million vote for Adams and 500,000 vote for Jefferson. Let's say that in Iowa, 1 million voters voted for Adams and 500,000 voted for Jefferson. Then lastly, in Illinois, 2 million people voted for Adams and 3 million voted for Jefferson. So if we add all of these popular votes up for these 3 states, the total popular vote for Adams is 5 million, and the total popular vote for Jefferson is 4. By the popular vote, Adams has more than Jefferson, so Adams wins the popular vote. But don't forget how the Electoral College votes are dispersed. So even though Adams won the popular vote, let's see how the Electoral College vote works out. Missouri is a winner-take-all. So because Adams won the popular vote, he gets all 10 Electoral College votes. Iowa is also a winner-take-all state. And because Adams won the popular vote there, he gets all 6 Electoral College votes. Illinois is also a winner-take-all state. So because Jefferson won the popular vote, he gets all 20 of the Electoral College votes. So even though Adams won the popular vote with 5 million over Jefferson's 4 million, he loses the Electoral College vote because Illinois has so many more electoral votes than even Missouri and Iowa combined. So that can help you kind of answer the question, how is it that a candidate can win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College, or win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote?